Resetting ties with China, Canada's Prime Minister visits Beijing, hailing what he calls a new partnership adapted to new global realities. The two countries are under pressure from US tariffs, so who stands to gain the most from this deal? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. The relationship between Canada and China has been acrimonious for years, but now the two countries seem to be embarking on a new chapter. Prime Minister Mark Carney has concluded a visit to Beijing, declaring it historic. Major trade deals were signed, easing the tariffs the two countries had imposed on each other. Carney said the new strategic partnership with China could set both nations up for what he described as the new world order. Many argue that Donald Trump's tariffs have pushed Canada and China to forge this partnership. We'll discuss the fallout from these two countries edging closer in a moment. But first, this report from Fintan Monaghan.
A grand welcome from Mark Carney in Beijing. It's the first visit to China by a Canadian Prime Minister in almost a decade. Carney hailed it as a new beginning.
Together, we can build on the best of what this relationship has been in the past to create a new one, adapted to new global realities that will deliver stability, security, and prosperity to our peoples on both sides of the Pacific.
Chinese President Xi Jinping also welcomed a fresh start with Canada.
A healthy and stable China-Canada relationship serves the common interests of our two countries. It is also good for the peace, stability and prosperity of the world.
The two sides made major concessions on trade. Chinese electric vehicles previously faced a 100% tariff. That will be slashed to just 6.1% for nearly 50,000 cars each year. Canadian farmers will now have much greater access to the Chinese market. Tariffs on canola seeds will drop from 84% to around 15%. Many are seeing all this as a reaction to the trade policies of the United States. Last year, US President Donald Trump imposed a raft of tariffs on nearly every country in the world. Many have since hammered out comprehensive new trade deals, but China and Canada still face major barriers to the US market. Trump's transportation secretary said Canada would regret its deal with China. But the reaction from Trump himself was much more muted.
Well, that's okay. That's what he should be doing. I mean, it's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that.
China and Canada have had a fraught relationship in the past. In 2018, Canada detained Chinese Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou following a US extradition order. Beijing retaliated by arresting two Canadians in a diplomatic standoff which lasted 2.5 years. Less than a year ago, Carney described China as his country's biggest geopolitical security threat. But now he speaks of pragmatism and of the US as no longer being a reliable partner. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this now with today's guests. And from Beijing, we're joined by Einar Tangen. He's a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, which is a Canadian think tank. In Los Angeles, William Lee, he's chief economist and managing director at Global Economic Advisors. And from Dubai today, we're joined by Jean Charest, former Canadian Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us on Inside Story to make sense of this important meeting that took place where you are, Einar, in Beijing. So, Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, hailing this as a new strategic partnership. First visit by a Canadian leader in 8 years, landmark state visit. Would you describe this as a big deal in more ways than one?
Yeah, it's a tremendously big deal. I mean, you have Donald Trump saying that he's going to dominate the Western Hemisphere, and yet you have one of the major northern powers coming to China and saying, look, we have to diversify away from the United States in reaction to what the U.S. is doing. But, if you take this from a year ago, it's moved from pretty hostile, from a disruptive power, that's how they're describing China, and now strategic partner. And I think that's all due to one person, Donald Trump.
OK, well, we'll get to how bad it was a little later. But William, in terms of what we know, and we are told, although it's a landmark deal, it's preliminary, we don't have all the details. Just explain to us what you think the basis of this deal is, please.
There's been a lot of pressure in Canada to get more exports, and Prime Minister Carney, I think, is being responsive to his electorate and trying to get a better deal for his constituents, mainly the farmers. And he's willing to trade some seeds for some electric vehicles, and I think that's a very good deal for that he thinks for the Canadian citizens. He's able to bring in some electric vehicles at lower price, perhaps than what's been able to be manufactured in Canada. And at the same time, he's allowing China to pay some of the government subsidies that have been paid to farmers and spreading the costs. And so I think from the American perspective, and so I think from the Canadian perspective, it's a beginning of a very good deal, a very opportunistic trade.
Jean, you can give us the Canadian perspective, a former deputy prime minister of your country, currently, though, today in Dubai. The deal, electric vehicles, the tariffs on them being cut, that Canada will allow into its market. And in return, Canada will get more of its canola. Maybe I should explain that. It's a crop that isn't everywhere in the world. The name comes up for can for Canada and ola for oil, but it's a form of rapeseed, isn't it, developed by Canadian scientists that's particularly healthy for the heart and good for cooking.
And you're very well informed. And Canada exports a lot of agri-food products to China and throughout the world. Canola is the biggest, most important agricultural product that we export to the United States. It represents about half of the value of what we export in terms of agri-food. And when we followed the Biden administration, who put 100% tariffs on electric cars coming in from China, and it's not that there weren't that many of them anyway, and that was the case in Canada. It was probably Tesla at the time. And we followed because our automotive market is very integrated with the United States. And it's really the manufacturing backbone of our relationship. And so the Trudeau government at the time, wanting to be a good player and a good ally, followed behind. And as a result, we ended up getting a massive tariff from China on our canola seed, on products, on pork products, and also seafood products. But the backdrop to all of this, you alluded to it, was to start with a very bad relationship because of Canada executing an extradition warrant against Meng Wanzhou, the founder of Huawei. This was in 2018, and it defined the relationship and put us in a very tense position for a number of years. So this meeting and this agreement is 180-degree turns in regards to where we were, as previously said, from describing China as being a disruptive power in our Indo-Pacific strategy delivered 2 years ago to now being a strategic partner for us is a very important change.
Jean, I probably should tell our viewers, just for full disclosure, that you were an advisor to Huawei during that crisis.
Well, yes, I was. I was involved, and that's a matter of public record. So, and we did some work for Huawei at the time. And just as a matter of record, also to put things in context, you know, the 3 days after she had been arrested, Mr. Trump was in government. He tweeted, it was tweets at the time, that if he could get a trade agreement with China, he would drop the charges. And thus followed the fact that two Canadians, two Michaels, their names were Michael, were literally kidnapped by the Chinese government and held for 1,000 days before they were finally released after a long and protracted negotiation.
Einar, you are shaking your head. You do not see it that way.
Well,
give us your take on that particular part of that story. Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's say it's not my opinion, it's the facts. One of the Michaels sued the Canadian government and in an undisclosed but very large sum, complained that he had been used as an unknown asset and that the other fellow was his handler. He had previously worked in the embassy and then had taken a year off. Now, you know, the chap that they were talking about had personal access to young Kim. And he was, of course, every intelligence agency in the world was wanting to know what insights he could give them about this. Now, whether he knew it or not, he claims he didn't. He got a large sum. But this idea that these two Michaels were kidnapped off the street randomly is a lot of nonsense. And that is confirmed by Canadian lawsuits and settlements, not China.
You made your point on that, Einar, and that is not the main point of our... Very quickly, if you can, Jean. Very quickly,
I was going to say, you're talking about allegations and lawsuits. It's not a proven fact. But I can certainly tell you from the perspective of Canada, and I think the international community who supported us at the time, that why else were they arrested? Certainly not, the timing of them being both arrested, both Michaels, put in jail for 1,000 days, was exactly related to the fact that Meng Wanzhou had been arrested on an extradition treaty on the behalf at the request of the United States. Certainly, you're not going to contradict that fact.
Okay, well, look, it's an important...
I'm not contradicting it. I'm pointing out that they burned your assets and your handler. That's it. They were retaliating.
I mean, this is an important issue, but it's not the issue of the day we're discussing here. So thank you for both making your views on that known. To you, William, though, and you've just heard how bad it got in terms of the disagreements about exactly what happened and why. If you'd looked a year ago at major trading nations around the world and you'd looked at ones which had a bad relationship, you may well have picked China and Canada, mightn't you? It was dreadful.
It was a difficult relationship, and I think Canada realizes that it's been well integrated into the North American continent, 200 years of history, common culture, and a tied economic system where manufacturing crosses borders seamlessly. That has been the fixture for Canada for decades and for centuries. And I think the dialogue you just heard shows you an example of how dealing with China can be very volatile. The rule of law that Canada, U.S. Has been so used to having is not something that is well found in China, at least in the way that we have practiced it here. So I think when you look at international relations with China, it has to be done with a bit of caution, and the agreements that you come up with have to be enforced. And the United States has found out that trade agreements, especially agricultural agreements, where China agrees to buy agricultural produce, has not always been fulfilled according to the terms of the contract. So Canada may right now be entering in the beginnings of a good partnership, and certainly Carney has found a good deal for Canada. But let's see if China fulfills its role. Certainly it hasn't during phase one of the trade deals with the United States with its promise to buy soybeans, and wound up going to Brazil to buy the so-called promised soybeans that it was supposed to buy from the U.S. So watch out for the deals that you make with China. Make sure you enforce them.
Jean, watch out! It's early. I'll bring you in a moment. I promise, Einar. But Jean, watch out! It's early days is the message from William, and it is worth recalling. Back in 2015, a new Prime Minister then, Justin Trudeau, wanted to improve relations with China, and it all went horribly wrong.
And Canada recognized mainland China in 1970 before the United States did. We had, historically in contemporary history, a good relationship with China, and so there always was a willingness for us to deal. But China, to return to the point made previously, we have to keep in mind we're dealing with two superpowers here: the United States and the South, who are not only our neighbor and our major trading partner, but also a superpower. And China's also a superpower. And superpowers behave a certain way. And when they have obstacles in front of them and issues, they tend to just swat them away. They're not always, there isn't always ill intent, but often Canada has been collateral damage in decisions made by the United States in regards to trade. And both countries have weaponized trade for political reasons. It's always amusing to hear the Americans say that Chinese weaponized trade. I mean, where did they learn that from? And so at the same time, Canada is a trading nation where we depend heavily on trade, very highly concentrated in the United States. The story's pretty simple. We all know that Mr. Trump now is much less reliable in terms of the relationships we have with him. We have to diversify. China is our second biggest partner, but at a much lower percentage than what we have with the United States, of course. And we can't work in the world and do trade without dealing also with China. So this is about establishing a reasonable, a good, healthy relationship between both countries and allowing Canada to diversify its trade.
So, Einar, if you can pick up from this really bad relationship that was there between China and Canada, what changed? I mean, we can talk about economics and politics, but in many ways it's about a person, isn't it? It's about Donald Trump. He's the thing that changed.
Yes, James, it's definitely all Donald Trump. But let me address my colleagues' earlier thought about China not fulfilling it. Now, remember, China agreed to buy at market prices. The market prices weren't available, and then we hit COVID. And there are a lot of things doing. In terms of equating China to the U.S., how many wars has China started? How much money are they pouring and arms are they pouring into the world? And at the root cause of this, who is causing Canada's problems right now? I don't think Canada would have shifted at all, except for the irrational behavior of Donald Trump. The point is, I came on the show with a very, very positive attitude. But what I sense here is, once again, this kind of colonial hypocrisy, talking about, oh, tut, those folks are uncivilized. They don't follow the international order, etc. Well, you certainly didn't with Meng Wanzhou, as you pointed out. You did some work on that. So let's stick to the positives of this. There are a lot of opportunities. Canada has a goal of 50% of trade outside the corridor of the United States. See if they can do it. China can certainly be a help with that. But these kind of throwing these allegations around is not helpful.
William, I mean, we've said it's about Trump and making Canada have real problems and having to diversify. But the problem facing Prime Minister Carney, yes, Trump claims that Canada is the 51st state, and clearly it's not. But if you look at its economy, it's almost like it is the 51st state because it is completely tied to the US. It's an enormous task, isn't it, to reposition the Canadian economy?
Well, James, rhetoric is rhetoric, and when political necessity called for Carney during the election to really become a distinguished Canadian who had Canadian interests in mind to get elected, he of course picked Donald Trump as the target for a lot of his accusations. But I think Canada knows, all Canadians know, that their standard of living has been tied to its integration with the United States. President Trump has made it very clear that he's interested in furthering the benefits of the North American continent. The 51st state phrase, I think, is a shorthand diplomatic use of the notion of securing the national security for the North American continent in terms of national defense, ensuring economic stability, ensuring that the relationships that have given both countries the high standard of living it's had for decades and centuries is maintained. I think those principles are still in place. The use of tariffs by President Trump has been one of investment and tariffs. He said, if you come invest in the United States, you get no tariffs. If you want to compete with the United States and import stuff into the United States, there's a tariff barrier to protect the domestic producers and foreign producers who produce in the United States from unfair competition. That's the principle. And I think that principle works not just for the betterment of the United States, but also Canada. And remember, I think the Jean can tell you that 85% of the trade between U.S. and Canada is exempt from any tariffs because of the USMCA. So I think the notion of U.S. wanting a 51st state is, as I said, a lot of political rhetoric and gets a lot of clickbait. But in terms of the realities of the situation, I think U.S. and Americans and Canadian citizens recognize that we are all Americans. We're North Americans, and ensuring the economic stability and soundness of our economies is paramount. And the high standard of living that Canada has and the United States has, that enjoys in the G7, the highest in the G7, is due to this tremendous partnership that we've had all this time, and that partnership hasn't changed. And in fact, it is strengthened if Canada is able to diversify its exports and find other partners, because diversifying trade for Canada is diversifying trade for North America, and that's good for the United States as well.
Jean, we said that the thing that had changed is Trump, but of course there's one other thing that's changed, and that's the Prime Minister of Canada. And it is worth noting what has happened in just a year, because it was exactly a year ago that Mark Carney announced he would run for the leadership of Canada's Liberal Party. And interestingly, when the election took place, the election campaign in your country in February and March last year, it was seen as one of his Achilles heels that he had close relations with China at that time.
And, you know, the election campaign in Canada a year ago turned into a referendum on who was best positioned to deal with Donald Trump. And the answer from the Canadian electorate was Mark Carney. And so during the election campaign, Carney, in his statements, was quite clear that China was a problem. I forget the exact words he used, but I think he probably described it as the biggest threat to Canada, which makes this agreement today even more significant in regards to where he was during the election campaign. But it is all about Donald Trump in the end. In Canada, and by the way, the United States will always be our number one economic partner, whatever the configuration is, tariffs, not tariffs. That's just the reality of geography and life. And so we, though, are looking for diversifying our trade to be less dependent on a partner who's become very volatile and unreliable in regards to our relationship, not just with us, but with also with the rest of the world. So China is, in that respect, a major player on the world scene, and finding a modus vivendi with China, being able to agree on basic trade, is in everyone's interest, the interest of Canada. Now, on USMCA, we're going to be starting up the negotiations this year. It is true, I guess what distinguishes Canada in its relationship with the United States relative to the rest of the world is that our supply chains are very, very integrated. And undoing our trade deal would cost billions of dollars and take a number of years. And so on both sides, I think there is a recognition that we should renegotiate the USMCA, maintain the trade agreement. At what conditions? It remains to be seen. That negotiation is going to happen in the next few months.
But interestingly, John, in recent days, Trump has said he thinks that deal is irrelevant. He's not worried about the car makers. He said all the cars should not be made in Canada or Mexico, none of the parts. It should all be made in the US. Einar, if you look at Canada's outreach in recent months to China, do you think that is even more vindicated by recent events, by the US's involvement in Venezuela, taking out President Maduro, and their threats against Greenland, and the new US national security strategy saying that in the Western Hemisphere, the US can assert itself confidently where and when they need to? Do you think all of these developments vindicate Carney's outreach?
I don't know, vindicate. I mean, he already understood what he was dealing with Donald Trump. You have on one hand a very seasoned politician who understands economics, has been at major banks. And then you have the other hand, you have a 6-time bankrupt, 42 convicted felons, and somebody who's been involved in a lot of very, very mysterious things. So, I mean, there's no comparison. But what the fact is, the United States elected this fellow twice, and there was a hiatus in between. So the idea that this is a one-off type of situation, tut, don't worry about it, I think those days have passed. The bookends have been moved, and no longer is the United States reliable. And this idea that somehow Canadians understand this 51st state, well, I suggest my colleague look at the opinion polls, which clearly say, and as well as the Not Buy American, that Canadians are not happy with this. They want a system of global governance. Everything you talked about, James, is repugnant to Canadians, and they don't understand why they've been treated so shabbily. but they know that they do have to diversify. Yes, it will always have a major trade relations with the United States, but it does not want to be taken for granted, nor does any other country in the world, because it's not just Canada who's suffering. Look at India. They thought that they were on the right side of the United States, AUKUS, etc. And now there's a subject to 500% tariffs coming down the road because they buy oil from Russia, which the United States told them to do to prevent an oil shock after they started the embargoes. It doesn't make any sense anymore. I don't know why my colleagues try to say, oh, don't worry about it. Do worry about it. Do something about it. Don't just assume that you're being co-opted is the best way to settle your future.
Jean, when we look at President Xi's remarks to Carney, according to the Beijing summary of what happened in the talks, he did say the two countries should treat each other with respect. Now, you know the sort of veiled language that's used in diplomacy sometimes. That suggests it's a warning not to criticise China too much in terms of its internal affairs or its human rights record. I mean, is there a potential problem here? Because there still are tricky issues. For example, Hong Kong, a large population of people who came from Hong Kong to China. Can Canada still, from Hong Kong to Canada, can Canada still speak out on issues like that if it's doing deals like the one we've just seen?
Well, Canada has spoken up, and using the word respect I found is pretty often used by the Chinese side in regards to any scenario in which they feel that another country is criticizing them. Hong Kong, is an interesting place for Canada. It's about 7.4 million people. And I think there's about 300,000 people, James, in that place in Hong Kong who have Canadian passports. So if something happens in Hong Kong, Canada would be concerned, certainly. And we've spoken up on these issues, and Canada will continue to speak up on the issues that are relevant to our values and what we feel are important for our citizens. At the same time, though, that there's a difference between that and lecturing other countries, and there is a broader consideration here of also dealing with countries and situations as they are. And in the case of China, we have a superpower here with whom we are going to be living for the foreseeable future, of course. And it's security issues that we have to keep in mind. It's not just about trade per se. It's about everything that's relevant to cybersecurity, for example. One of the issues we didn't talk about today is that we had a commission of inquiry about electoral interference in Canada, and Hong Kong is one of the, not Hong Kong, China was one of the jurisdictions that was found to be involved in political interference. So it's all of this.
There's so much to discuss. So much to discuss here, Jean. But that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to our guests today, Einar Tangen, William Lee, and Jean Charest. If you missed any of our conversation, don't worry. This and all of our recent programmes can be viewed whenever you want on our website, aljazeera.com. What should we discuss next time? Leave us your suggestions on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or use X. Look for @AJ Inside Story. Until next time, from me, James Bays, and the entire team here, stay safe. Bye-bye for now.